Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here today. We have on the show today Ken Schuetz. He is a professor at the CU Leeds School of Business. That's the University of Colorado here in Boulder. He's also the CEO and founder of Aligned Influence. I met Ken a few years back. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. He helps with a local school I'm on the board of, and he's also been just a great asset in terms of helping local churches in the area. Now, Ken is working with churches all over, but not just churches, boards in general, boards of nonprofits, executives, all that kind of stuff. So, Ken, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So, you wrote this book, Aligned Influence Beyond Governance. And at first glance, some of my podcast audience may be like, what is this about? This is not an academic book. This is not, a cultural book, all that kind of stuff. But I want to pose to the audience, if you're a listener, this concept, this topic is extremely relevant. What we've seen over the last few years in all organizations has been tension at the highest levels of leadership, unable to move forward. A lot of times churches splitting over issues such as COVID, Black Lives Matter, elections, whatever it may be. And so a lot of pastors, a lot of church leaders are going like, what did we get wrong? How did we structure this thing so that we got so sideways with one another? A lot of times it comes down to personal beefs or whatever it may be. All of a sudden we're yelling at one another, all that kind of stuff. It didn't happen in our church, thank God, but I've heard that story countless times. And so I think this book provides a way forward for a lot of organizations, even if you're a business leader, how you think about governing your business. This is extremely important. And so I'm really excited to have Ken on for that reason. I wanted to first, for our audience, Ken, when I planted a church, I didn't know a lot about board governance. I just knew that the government needed us to have bylaws, a statement of faith. There needed to be a board, but I wasn't even sure what the board did. And in some Baptist churches, you'll have like the board of deacons, and they kind of run the church. And some churches, you'll have the board of elders. Some are just senior pastor. He kind of operates as the pope, de facto pope of that congregation or mega church. And so can you give me clarity on, like, in our modern context, in the American system, what is board governance? Where did it come from, and why is it so important?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I think understanding governance is being able to come back to this question of why do you have a board? Why do you have governance? Really comes back to this question of who's required to have a board. So remember, those that are required to have a board are publicly held for-profits, those who can buy shares in another company, nonprofits, and civic organizations like counties, cities, and all the authorities that they can launch. And what's similar about all of those is that in every case, they're managing somebody else's money. They're managing the interests of somebody else. And so the reason we have a board is that the interests of more than just the CEO have to be protected here. More than just the lead pastor have to be protected here. More than just the executive director have to be protected here. And so boards are put in place to make sure that the interests of that whole, the shareholders, the donors, the taxpayers, the members of the congregation, and in the church context, the interest of our Lord and Savior are protected in that. Because all of those stories that you started to tell about things where things have failed, it's because we now start to have my interest, your interest, and those my interest, your interest have divided the church. When I go around the country, I work with lots of organizations. 70% of them are faith-based. But what I see is the most divided places in our country are the churches, are the faith-based organizations. And it shouldn't be. When Jesus prayed for us, he prayed for that we be unified, right?
Right.
That there be unity, and that we have come to a place where that's not what we're known for, is unity.
Yeah, there's a lot of division in a lot of churches, and it's really disheartening. And especially for people in the pews, it can be very confusing because as a leader, a lot of times, this stuff is happening in a board meeting, and then the executive director, the pastor, the elder still have to lead. And so it can be really confusing, really disheartening. And I think a lot, You want to talk about people walking away from the church. I think a lot of it starts with this matter of leadership and the pain
Absolutely.
they've seen, the division they've seen. One of the books that when I got into ministry, that was kind of held up as the gold standard for a lot of pastors in my tribe was this book, Biblical Eldership by Alexander Strock. And for a lot of people, it really meets that need of like, okay, I'm an elder now, or they'll make that part of their elder process, that they have a process to become a board member at their church. And so they read this book, and it posits kind of like some features from the Bible. It does exegesis, it goes into the scriptures, and the kind of the big principle in there is the first among equals principle. And so you'll hear that a lot in churches. And I think your book offers a different example of that. Could you highlight for maybe my listeners how your book offers a different example than biblical eldership?
Sure. Actually, when I talk to churches, I say there are really three failed approaches that we have taken. One of those starts out with this: everything we need to know about governing the church is in the Bible. And it turns out that that's just not true. Um, and when you try to actually do what Strock did, that is, uh, use only the Bible, and why wouldn't something called biblical eldership be the right thing to point to? That when you do the exegesis, when you do the word study, you come to this place of the same words are used for pastor to describe the pastor as to describe the elder, and so there must be no difference. And, and so the churches I run into that have fully adopted this end up a few years later in this place where, so what's your role? What's my role? We're all elders. We're all staff. I don't get it. Really, in fact, we end up in this place where if we just try to do that, we end up in a place that's completely tangential to what we know about good governance.
How is that so? Like, tease that out for my listeners a little bit.
Yeah, that good governance actually talks about the board actually being independent from the CEO, the lead pastor, the executive director, so that they can protect the interests of those who they've been set up to protect. When boards cannot act independently, that governance fails. That boards are there because, in fact, if we only act in a self-interested way, we might end up doing things. That lead pastor, that CEO, that executive director might end up doing things that actually harmed those whose interests they're supposed to be protecting. And uh, so we end up in a place that is completely tangential to what governance is supposed to be. I and I think Strock was trying to do the right thing, but ended up in the wrong place. And so it's one of those, So the three things that I say are the everything we need to know about the Bible is, or everything we need about governance is in the Bible. That's a failed place. Pastor's CEO in the early '90s, we saw that, and that was everybody trying to apply the work of another guy named Carver to the church, and for the same reasons, just Carver as is didn't didn't accomplish everything we needed to do. We call it policy governance today. That what we know is that policies are an important tool, but policies alone will not get us where we need to be. And the final one is because there's been so much frustration that what I hear all over the country is that even some Bible colleges are saying to their pastors, many of them I hear this, pastors tell me we had 1 week on this in Bible college and seminary. And what we were told was, in the end, you know how to run the church. They don't. Just don't let them get in your way
Oh, wow.
of the board. And in fact, the board's job sometimes actually is to get in the way
Right.
of the what a self-interested CEO, lead pastor, executive director might be doing.
Yeah, agreed. And it really just puts a thumb right on the pressure point that a lot of leaders are facing. So why don't we get into the model itself? How
Yeah,
does your model work? If we were to implement your model, what are kind of some of the key principles that you tease out in your book, Aligned Influence?
yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to, if we take apart those three failed approaches, that Strock tried to say doing exegesis gets us there. And exegesis said there was no difference between these roles. That Carver's work said policies are the key position. And that didn't get us where we needed to go. And if we just don't let them get in our way, we're in the wrong place as well. So what my work has unpacked over the years that I've been doing this work is that, in fact, it's not policies that will be the magic. What needs to happen is alignment. And to align something, you have to have two things to align. And so what we have to do is we have to come up with a way to be able to clearly articulate what the role of that CEO, executive director, lead pastor is supposed to be doing. And a way to clearly articulate what that board, the board of elders, the board of directors, the board of trustees, what their role is, and to create unique, well-defined roles for them that are alignable, which now that alignment becomes the key. Now, once we have clear roles that are alignable, now all of a sudden we can go back and think about what Carver did in the early 90s. Really great work in this thought around what should boards bound with policies, and we can start to apply his work in the context of one of those roles the board has. So I talk about the executive having three roles. The board having three roles: to direct the work, to protect the work, to enable the work. And the executive having three roles: to lead the work, to manage the work, and to accomplish the work. So that both think about the future of the organization. The board thinks about the future by directing it. That is, defining what's to be accomplished, who's to be served, and ideals to be maintained. So back to those concepts, that division that we're talking about in churches, that actually for the board to talk about what are the ideals that we unify around. What is it that identifies us? Who do we serve? And the executive, the lead pastor, the CEO, being able to take that direction and now create 3 to 5 year plans and budgets that support those to move us forward. What are the programs we need? What are the people we need? What are the positions we need for volunteers and those kinds of things? The second layer is the day-to-day. The board protects that. They put protective boundaries in all those areas that the CEO, executive director, lead pastor has to manage in, like managing people and managing programs and managing money and managing risk, and puts boundaries around those in such a way to say, lead pastor, you're going to be safe. The church is going to be safe if you stay in these boundaries. Now you can do anything you want outside of those to accomplish this work, but just stay safe. And the executive then, the lead pastor, actually manages by creating operational policies and procedures. Think in the church, how we do children's ministry, how we do youth ministry, how we manage money on Sunday morning, all those kinds of things. The third one is do roles. Both have a do role. The do role of the board is to enable the work. That is, to use their spheres of influence to either metaphorically or really wearing the church on their lapel, so that every conversation they have on Sunday morning at the church or during the week at work or at coffee or at golf or at sporting events, whatever it is, to be able to advocate for what's going on at the church, to make visible what's going on at the church, to engage people in those conversations, and to think about now the talents and resources that they have that might help the church move forward. And finally, the do role for the lead pastor and their team is actually to accomplish the work. It's the lead pastor and their team that are accomplishing the work of ministry at the church. Now, sometimes those same people that are on the board are going to be teaching in a class, or they're going to be taking care of children on Sunday morning, or they're going to be whatever. And in that case, they are working as part of a volunteer team to the pastor's team to accomplish that work. I think now all of a sudden we have alignable roles, and I have seen this work over and over and over in churches. That helps bring clarity and helps make sense of this. And it's not, it is, even though that's not uh, uh, biblical in the sense that you can't see those 6 words in the Bible,
Sure.
I think it's very biblical in the sense if you look at 1 Timothy 3 about this alignment between those that oversee and those that get the work done.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, and that's obviously I think would be a big point of maybe disagreement or concern with a lot of people is like, well, we're just taking a modern framework and applying it to the Bible, but just in terms of how it plays out for people, just on a day to day basis, I've seen how this model can really bring life to an organization and help it. One of the things that I have a question about, and we've talked about this, is immediately if you're a lead pastor, you're a pastor listening to this, or maybe you're an executive listening to this you're gonna go like, "Well, then I'm totally cut out of the power dynamic," because it seems as if now, they don't want me to lead. It's like I work for the board in a sense. And so how do you address that with organizations that come to you that raise that concern?
Yeah. It's interesting that one of the key things that pops up, key questions is the lead pastor on the board?
Right.
Uh, and my answer back is, well, you're going to have to decide that. But here's what I can tell you: if I went to any other nonprofit in the United States and said the executive director is a member of the board, they would go, "Huh." Uh, that we know that in the for-profit world, that the Cadbury Committee in '92 that was in the UK that set out, here are the recommendations for what governance should look like, recommended that those be separated because they weren't. Frankly, we know that's not happened in publicly held for-profit. 50 Around 50% of the organization still have one person at the top of the organization that's both leading the board and leading the executive team. And we know that it's caused problems. I have a church that has gone through this. They've just brought on a new pastor, and that new pastor came from a church where his story was uh, one of total discord between the eldership and the board, and he was on the board. Uh, and he would say, I was on the board, and the fact that I was on the board did not save me from being harmed by the organization. I think, frankly, why we in the church today, if I went to any church and said, be careful about, here's this separation of duties, they would throw me out the front door if I talked about the pastor not being on the board. And frankly, we've come to that because there's been so much dysfunction in governance of churches that pastors have said, I'm never going to let that happen again. I'm going to be on the board so they can't harm me.
Sure.
And this pastor would tell you, I was on the board and I still got harmed.
Yeah, right. So how would you, because according to our bylaws, like at our church, we have the problem you're highlighting. And I wouldn't pitch it as a problem, but that it's just a lot of churches are like us where, the lead pastor, we have two, and we serve terms as the chairman of the board. So every year we rotate. And then we have elders that make up the board. We try to have an outsized view or outsized number of lay elders compared to anyone that's paid by the church. So there's always the power dynamic is always outsized by people who are not paid by the organization. Can your model be compatible with that system, or in order to apply your principles and apply your model, must that system be not totally, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but must it be revamped to where the lead pastor is no longer on the board of the organization?
What I always tell the organizations, churches I work with is, this is your church. You need to govern it but here are the principles.
Okay.
And now here are the principles. That principle that there needs to be separation, there needs to be independence. And frankly, the story you just told, there's not much independence there.
Right.
And so I'm going to put this in front of you, and I'm going to say, now, what do you see? How independent are you? Can the board really do something that is in contrast to what the lead pastor wants to do? Frankly, I think the 6 o'clock news these days, may it never be, but it is, that the 6 o'clock news these days are often full of stories about churches where we don't have this separation, where we have somebody that, even if they don't have the position that says I'm the chairperson of the board, they have so much charismatic personal power that they are actually driving both. And we end up with churches on the 6 o'clock news because of failures.
Agreed.
And there not being any governance structures that protect that.
Yeah. So one question I would have then is, when we look at the New Testament, which I know you kind of push against a little bit as far as the comprehensive picture, but at the same time, he's given us the Word of God. The Word of God is sufficient for ecclesial matters. Where do we see your model? Like, is the board in your model equivalent to elders? Or do you find a way, not around it necessarily, but do you phrase it differently to where the pastor, the lead pastor, and there's other elders, and then there's this separate entity called a board and they are not elders? How do you kind of square your model? Because what I see in the New Testament, I mean, as much as I've walked away from biblical eldership as the book and the concept in some ways, there still is, I see in the New Testament, it's kind of, there are these shepherds, there are these elders, bishops, whatever word you want to use, that govern the church, and there's a teaching role assigned, all this kind of stuff. So how do you kind of square that with what you see in the Bible?
Yeah, I think the Bible isn't very explicit.
Okay.
I think the most explicit we get is 1 Timothy 3, where we're talking about the role of overseers and the office of overseers and the office of servant leaders. That frankly, if we said, the Bible has everything we need to know, I actually, if you go on my website, there's a set of videos from a pastor in Oklahoma, Rod McIlvain, that actually talks through this and says, when he looks at this and when his elders looked at this, this set of churches does it this way, and this set of churches does it this way, and this set of church does it this way, and all say it's biblically relevant.
Sure.
So what does that mean? I think that piece of understanding what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us there are those that should be overseers, and there are those that should be servant leaders. And that clarity ought to move forward. If we dig deeper and we try to get down to that point about episcopo and I just lost the other word.
Elders or
Yeah, but
bishops or whatever.
yeah, that we ended up where Strzok ends up, and that is there's no difference between them.
Sure.
And so we have to come to clarity about how are we going to, would the Bible really put us in a place where, in fact, there is disclarity. There is a place where it's not functioning appropriately. I think what Rod would say, just looking historically, he'd say it seems like in every situation in history that the church has looked to what's going on in the context of the church to say, what should we be accomplishing? Most would say that what we see in the Bible came out of the intertestamental period, the Maccabees and the synagogue, and how governance was done in the synagogue.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I wanted to ask just briefly because it seems like the model would work really well in a congregationally governed church where because there's kind of three models, the Episcopal model, the Presbyterian model, and the congregational model. And it seems that this model is particularly helpful in a congregational model. Have you seen this model work well in like a Presbyterian model where you have the pastor is actually employed by the presbytery, he's hired and placed by the presbytery at a local church, and then you have teaching elders and ruling elders in that local church? Does your model work well there?
Sure. So really what you just described is, I would say, sort of or what I think it can come about is what you described is it's either this or it's this. It's either congregational or it's Presbyterian. What we've found as we work with lots of organizations is that the church is a classic membership model. And it turns out that the same things we find in the church we find in organizations that are membership organizations. Now we come down to this place of what's the role of the board, the presbytery or the elders. What's the role of the servant leaders, and what's the role of the congregation? That when we put it that way, now a set of bylaws in churches that I think have made that place where it's in the middle, it's identifying all three. What's the role for those that are overseeing? What's the roles for those that are the key leaders of the church? And what's the role of the congregation? Because even in those places where there are elders, now all of a sudden the congregation still has to do things like, usually in the bylaws, has to do things like be the final approval for selling or buying property. Often in those, I see that they are the ones that are identifying who are people who are already playing and capable of playing the role of one of those elders as they move forward. That affirming being a final affirmation of a budget, because they're the ones that this congregation are going to be the ones that have to put the money together to actually support that budget.
Right.
And so when I've seen this in the most healthy way, it is not either this or this. It is how those things come together. And we understand that all of those things exist in this context. Those that oversee, those that do, and a congregation or membership that exists as well.
Okay. So just to tease it out for our listeners in the few minutes we got left, if let's say, because we've seen this, let's say a pastor gets sideways on some stuff. Let's say he's either promoting kind of some woke ideology, or even more extreme would be like trans ideology, which is kind of wrapped up into that, and we don't need to parse all that out. But let's say the pastor gets sideways and the board wants to do something, or if you want to make it even more practical, the pastor's trying to implement mask requirements, the board doesn't want to. How does your model help alleviate that tension there or provide a way forward?
Yeah, for that board that says our pastor is going off, my question back to you is, so what direction have you provided to that pastor?
Okay.
What direction up to this point have you provided to that pastor to say this is who we are? These are the ideals that are central to what we do. I think often when we end up at this place, when a board feels like it needs to get down, and that I want to say to the board, come back with me back here, and what's missing in your direction that clearly states what we're going to accomplish. Frankly, what really almost always I find is there is no direction.
Right.
There's never been any place where the board has actually provided direction. They've not really understood from a governance standpoint their responsibility to do that. So they drop down into the day-to-day management of stuff. That I would say, board, what are the boundaries? How do the boundaries speak into this that is going on? More often, what you're talking about, those kinds of issues, I think are more in direction. What does it mean? There are churches out there that have come for them, have said, we are going to be open and affirming.
Right.
And for the board to really be at the front of that, talking about what does that mean? And
Right.
if we're going to do that, then we, the board, need to talk about what that means.
Right.
Um, uh, and if not, to be clear about what that means.
Yeah, and provide direction. I think a lot of boards just have never either been invited to provide direction, or they've never been permitted to, or maybe the bylaws don't allow them to, because, for a lot of times the pastor is the one that's tasked with both the doing and the setting of the vision and the bound, like all that stuff. And so I think what appeals to me about the model, even though obviously don't follow it as closely, is that it distributes power in a way where people can get along more harmoniously, more in unity. It provides clarity. It also alleviates the pastor of some pretty heavy burdens the pastor carries if he can trust, that God has placed me here with these people, with these men, to govern this church. All of a sudden the pastor's freed up to do the work of the ministry rather than having to like be this intermediary between these people who are complaining to him about the church and this board that he sits on who don't know about the complaint, and now he's trying to keep everybody happy. I mean, how many pastors are burdened with that awful awful feeling of like, I've just got to keep everybody happy. And this model, I think, provides a way to go like, it's not, I don't have to do that. I mean, yeah, I need to I need to not needlessly cause offense, but yeah, it's not my primary
I
job.
so much want to agree with what you just said, because that burden is now turns into burnout.
Yeah.
Uh, I again was just talking with uh, a pastor and their executive pastor, who are dealing with uh, the situation that you were just talking about. And I said, so if there's not this clarity, the pastor is usually directing, protecting, enabling, and leading, managing, accomplishing. And what we see all over the country is when they're doing all those things, they burn out and go away.
Yeah.
And he said, you could almost see his shoulders do this. He said, that's where I am.
Yep.
Something's got to change or I've got to go away
Absolutely.
because I'm just burning out.
Yeah.
Yeah, another version uh, of that same burnout is a pastor that described been at a church 25 years, uh, was very loved by their congregation, but found themselves doing all six of those things: directing, protecting, enabling, leading, managing, accomplishing. And what they said is it scared them to death that they held all this power, and that one wrong move on their part could lead this congregation off the cliff. And so that that led this congregation, him, to be extremely conservative,
Yeah.
never taking any risks, never doing anything that would be other than just sort of keeping your head down and being the church.
Right.
And he said, at the end of my 25 years, and now seeing this framework, I see exactly what's been going on, that I've been carrying all six of these, and there's been no one that was there to say we ought to be going in this direction, and we ought to be maintaining these ideals, that we ought to make sure these boundaries are in place and we don't go past these boundaries. Because if I had that, I would have been much more likely to have said, well, if that's true, I think we can be the church in this way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is true for a lot of pastors. You always hear the pastor that's kind of this, whether you use the word abuse or tyrant or whatever, but I think there's a lot of, pastors who are just looking for a better way to lead that's less burdened, not trying to absolve themselves of responsibility, but but have clarity on what the responsibility is. I know this was part of my story. It's part of the reason we try to shift things around governance wise, because I'm like, man, like if we die tomorrow, if I die tomorrow and it's left, you know, we're trusting that the organization can be run by these guys. I don't know if we've trained and equipped these guys. And so I think that's why a lot of churches get so obsessed with the lead pastor. And we have this kind of cult of personality in a lot of churches with mega church culture, where it's about rhetoric and, throttling the right message at the right time in order to either not take risks, not teach clearly on social political matters, whatever it may be, because they haven't been enabled and they haven't been given boundaries to lead with courage. And instead, they're constantly on the defense and concerned. And in the worst case, of course, they start, they do behave in a way that would be tyrannical, where they're kicking people out, or we're just saying it's my way or the highway or whatever it may be. And it can create a very nasty power dynamic. And I think, I'm sure there's listeners out there who have seen this, experience this in at least one church in their lifetime. And so that's why I really appreciate the model. Even if somebody doesn't take it wholesale and bring you in and have you become like, give them the way forward, but it at least like brings attention with a highlighter to these tensions that a lot of people have been experiencing over the last few years. Um, I think that one of the things that I've appreciated about it, and I'd love you to speak about this, is the issue of power dynamics. And if you sit with Ken, I think in the book, on the front of the book, I know it has this as cogs. Can you talk about why it's important to distribute the power in organizations, whether it's a for-profit, nonprofit, or a church? Why is this so crucial to get right?
Yeah. Well, you're talking about this picture. So if anybody goes to alignedinfluence.com, they're going to see this picture of these gears. There you are.
Yeah, if you're on video, I've got it held up right now.
Yeah, those gears, and so that the picture on the front is sort of the what an aligned organization looks like. But imagine those two gears if they were misaligned. Uh, when you draw that picture, people talk about, well, what's wrong with that picture? Well, there's no way, engineers in the room will say, there's no way that power can be transferred from one of those gears to the other. And so there's no way for the authority of the eldership to be transferred to the pastor. In that they look at that and they say, well, those two gears could be spinning in different directions at different speeds and both look like they're functioning appropriately. And you see this all the time. The elders say, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And the pastor says, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, but they're doing it separately.
Totally.
And they're not being effective, and they're being frustrated about why they can't move forward in an effective way. So that concept of power, how does power be, how is aligned and how is it be transferred, is critical in this relationship, because in fact, in many of those others organizations, it's or those other models, it is trying to retain power in some way rather than having something. I'm always trying to defend myself from the elders, or we're defending the church from the pastor, or something that's going on. There's always this defensiveness. If we were able to get to a point where we could be proactively talking about direction that's to be set and boundaries to be lived within, and to be actively monitoring that, so we're having conversations, now all of a sudden something good can happen. There was another thought that your question brought to me, and I'm trying to come back to what that other thought was. The concept of power being shared, or actually having clear roles, so that here's the way my authority as the eldership is communicated in that direction, those protective boundaries, and the power of the lead pastor is clearly communicated in the way that they structure their ministry and develop their curriculums and those kinds of things. I think that becomes really, really important. In places where that isn't happening, you find divisiveness, you find division, you find frustration. And I'm going to go back to you were talking about there's so much emphasis on maintain or retaining the lead pastor,
Yeah.
that this isn't just a church thing. This is every organization has a board and executive that we're finding. It's the issues of retention and transitions.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this in the church big time. That if this kind of alignment isn't in place, there's two things. One is you will not retain the lead pastor, because if this alignment isn't in place, they're either going to burn out or you're going to drive them away. Number one. And number two, if you don't have this kind of alignment in place, the board is not ready to manage a transition, to do a search, and to attract the right new leader. Because people that are well prepared leaders can smell bad governance,
Right.
and you're not going to attract the kind of person that you want to attract if you don't have good governance in place. They can, if they're experienced, I haven't found a pastor yet that couldn't tell me about a horror story they had from governance of the church that they were in. This whole idea of being able to have a healthy environment to attract and to then structure a search, here's what your role will be, here's what our role will be. In fact, I'm having the same conversation with search firms, Slingshot and other firms around the country, because they see the same thing. They see that their searches are hampered by subpar governance environments.
Yeah, it's a huge issue, especially with the older generation. I think the average age of pastor used to be like mid 30s and now it's mid 40s. And you see a whole crop of pastors that they're keeping in ministry, and that's not a judgment, that's just reality. And so you're having to replace them eventually. That's coming like in the next 10 years. And yet we have lower attendance in seminaries and institutions. So the talent pool is smaller for those churches to pull from. And if they don't have good governance, a lot of these younger pastors are very cynical on a lot of that stuff. They're going to step into a mess. And even especially with like a church plant, the founding pastor, it's like a running joke in my circles. Whoever follows the founding pastor, he'll be done within 3 years. Like because so much of the governance is tied up in the charisma of the founding
Oh my
pastor.
gosh. Oh
And
my
so
gosh. Yes.
it's just like all the time you see whoever that next guy is. I mean, I don't know of one story that it's gone well. I'm sure there has been one, but it's just so tied up. The governance is so tied up in that person that that next guy stepping into it is just like it'll never work. It just can't work based on the governance. Why, in your model, why would you say that is?
Well, I use two words to describe that: situational and structural. That if you say to me, our governance is working really well right now, is that because of a situation? That is, who's on the board or who's your pastor right now, or some structure that would be successful, whoever is there. And so what our endeavor is to help churches, organizations move from situational to structural. Because sometimes we come into an organization in a situation where they're really healthy and they say, I don't think we need that. And my answer is, I'm glad that you're in a place of peace right now. But is that because there's a structure in place that if I pulled this pastor out or this elder off and replaced them with this elder or this pastor, would it still be peaceful? Or would that not be true? I see this constantly. In fact, again, on my website, there's another set of videos I just did with a Christian school up in northern Indiana. And this head of school and board chair have this discussion. They said, we were healthy we weren't, we weren't, we're growing, we're healthy, but we were healthy. They said we're healthy until June 1st.
Mm.
I said, we're healthy until June 1st. What happens June 1st? We have new elders cycle. We have new board member cycle on.
Okay.
And we have new board member cycle on. It just depends on what they believe and
Yeah,
who they
totally. Yeah.
are. And they said, we know, after doing this work, they said, we no longer feel that, because now when we bring a new board member on, we say, this is what a healthy board structure looks like. This is your role. This is the head of school's role. This is how we function together. And they said it's moved us from being healthy to great.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this, one of the things we talk about, and I've heard talked about, is like, you've got to move from a verbal culture where things are just assumed to a written culture. You've got to write it down. You've got to structure it out, especially if it's healthy. If it's unhealthy and you do that, bad news, hire Ken. But if it's healthy, you got to still hire Ken or somebody like him. You got to get some clarity on these matters because it's really important. Ken, I really appreciate your work. Where can people pick up a copy of your book?
Probably the easiest place is Amazon.com. Just go to Amazon and either search for Ken Schuetz or for Aligned Influence, and you'll find the book.
All right, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then you have a website as well where you've referenced some videos. What's the website domain they can go to?
It's www.alignedinfluence, ALIGNED, aligned, and then influence spelled out.com.
That's excellent. Well, Ken, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Blessings.
Hey, if you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you'd sign up on the Patreon. Patreons are how I bring this content to you. So go in the link to in the show notes, click there. If you sign up for $5 a month, you're going to get a sticker in the mail. If you sign up for $15 a month, you get a mug in the mail with the logo of the show on there. Patrons, you guys really help me bring this content to you. So thank you for signing up there. It really helps me bring great content to you. And we will see you next time.